Well, the title comes from the first proper letter that Charles Manson ever wrote me back in the spring of 1975. And in that letter, among other things, he said, "That beast was not me," referring to the media's portrayal of him. He said, "That beast was not me, but it's what everyone needs me to be, so they make me up to be a reflection of their fears, lies, and bullshit." And I came to see that as a very characteristic protest from a lot of repeat killers. They're too arrogant to want to submit to anyone else's definition of who they are. So they always lean back against anyone's attempts to explain why they do what they do or to portray them in a particular way. So I thought "That beast was not me" was kind of a representative protest. The other reason that I chose that as my title is that running throughout my book is the theme of how difficult it sometimes is to draw bold lines between criminals and the rest of us. While most people don't commit the kinds of violent acts that people like Charles Manson and John Wayne Gacy and Ted Bundy committed, thank God, they are fascinated by those people and just can't get enough of hearing about them and their crimes. And throughout my book, I bring up a number of things, including some things about myself that kind of make that question a problem. How do you draw those lines? So I chose the title for that reason as well. In a way, it sounds like me saying I'm nothing like these people. You know, that beast, those killers are not me. But in my book, I continually raise questions about where that line should be drawn. I grew up as the son of I always describe my dad as a Hoover-era G-man, an old-school FBI agent. And so one of the things that characterized the life of an FBI agent back then, I think it's a little different now, but agents would get transferred every year or two. So kind of like a military kid, I was always moving around. I think I lived in 8 different places before we kind of settled for good in Western New York, near Niagara Falls, right before I was going to begin my 4th grade year. So a lot of movement. I had a peripatetic kind of childhood. For years, when people would ask me, you know, what's your most vivid childhood memory? I would give this answer that now, looking back, I think is a very poignant answer. I would say waving goodbye to my friends. And, you know, that was what a lot of my early childhood consisted of, living in a place a year, then waving goodbye to my friends and getting ready to go somewhere else. So growing up the son of an FBI agent meant a lot of emotion. It also meant that in the air that I breathed growing up was talk of criminal justice and criminals and the law. And so I was interested in that in my young way. And I was also interested, for reasons I can't totally account for, I was always interested in outsiders and outliers and unusual, strange people. And in one sense, I think, well, I often felt like an outsider myself, getting adjusted to the new school, the new neighborhood, needing to make new friends. So maybe that was part of the reason why I was drawn to all kinds of strange, unusual people, snake handlers, criminals. In my book, I tell the story of when I was 8 years old, and in 3rd grade, my dad was assigned to FBI headquarters in Washington at the time, and we went on a family trip to Ford's Theater. And most kids probably would have come away from that with a renewed interest in the Civil War or Abraham Lincoln. Not me. I couldn't get enough of the conspirators who were involved in the plot to kill the president. There were 8 of them. And I studied this pamphlet my parents bought me called The Crime at Ford's Theater, learned the backgrounds of all these people, still have vivid, like photographic images of them in my mind 60 years later. So I was only 8 and already kind of exhibiting that fascination with criminals and outsiders that became a hallmark of my adulthood. Becoming a forensic psychologist never occurred to me during my childhood, my adolescence, or my young adulthood. We can maybe get to this later, but the thought of becoming a forensic psychologist didn't enter my mind until I guess I was 30 or in my early 30s. That was the first time I ever considered that as a career option. Yeah, well, I remember I was pretty young when I encountered, I must have seen it on TV. It was a grainy black and white film of snake handlers in Appalachia. And I was just absolutely fascinated with the drinking of strychnine and handling these poisonous snakes. And I thought, someday I'm gonna find out more about these people in person, which I did eventually. But that was one example. I was also, I don't know exactly when this began, though I have a couple ideas, but I was always fascinated in sideshow performers, otherwise known as freaks, and the people who flocked to see them, and the interesting dynamic between the audience and the performers. I was also interested in severely mentally ill people. My paternal grandfather was a psychiatrist and the superintendent of a number of large psychiatric hospitals in New England during my years growing up. So we would go to visit him and my grandma and walk around the grounds of these hospitals and just see these people behaving in ways that were at once terrifying and fascinating to me. I remember one episode where my grandparents, my parents, and my sister and I were walking around the grounds of this hospital, and a woman got on the ground and was screaming into what looked like a hole for the devil to come out. And I was old enough to think that perhaps he was down there and might come out, but I just thought, you know, why is this woman behaving that way? And what's wrong with her? So I was interested in seriously mentally ill people, criminals. I mean, not only the Crime at Ford's Theater criminals, but lots of others. So those are a few examples. My dad died in 1998. So at that time I had been in practice for about 8 years. So he lived to see me get pretty seriously involved in consultations on death penalty cases. He didn't have much sympathy for the entire defense enterprise in criminal cases. He was a law enforcement officer, so most of his contacts were with prosecutors who were on the other side of the case. And my dad used to talk about being harassed by defense attorneys when he was called as a witness in a criminal case, and the defense attorneys would attempt to eviscerate him while he was on the witness stand, and he didn't appreciate that at all. And now here is his son kind of usually consulting at the request of defense attorneys on death penalty cases. And I think he thought that was a little weird that I ended up kind of on the other side of criminal cases, but he always supported me. You know, he never, and he was proud of me. He was proud of the work that I did, so I got into forensic psychology as the result of a double homicide that occurred at the hospital where I was then a young up-and-coming administrator. And that's a whole story in itself, maybe we'll get into, but yeah, I decided that I wanted to know more about the kind of person who could have killed my two co-workers. And the police didn't arrest anyone, there were no known suspects. And that's what prompted me to go to graduate school and begin working on my PhD in psychology with an eye toward eventually becoming a forensic psychologist. And I was always interested in violent crime, so death penalty cases were a natural for me. And when I first opened my private practice, I did some networking. I talked with some people at the State Public Defender's Office, made my interest known to work on capital cases, and they were really the ones who got me involved in my very first death penalty case. And a lot happened as a result of what went on in that case. It was definitely baptism by fire. I was very green. I didn't really know too much about what I was doing. And as it turned out, that was a double whammy, because in doing death penalty work, it can sometimes be a negative thing if you've got a lot of experience, because the prosecution attempts to paint you as a witness for hire, or you work on all these death penalty cases. So in one sense it was good that I was new, fresh. I remember the prosecutor, when he cross-examined me during the sentencing phase of that trial, saying, well, I can't find anything out about you, Dr. Smalldon. I've looked online. This was in the early days of computers even. He said, I've looked online, I can't find anything about you. And for the defense side, that was seen as a very good thing, that he couldn't find things to use as weapons to try to undercut my credibility. But the interesting thing, that was a very high publicity case. It was the case of a very big, imposing African-American man who grew up in downtown Dayton. And he had a long criminal history. He was already serving time at maximum security Lucasville prison for murdering his former wife's grandmother. He had terrorized an entire family in a community south of Columbus, where he raped the daughter, kept the whole family hostage for an entire night, threatened to kill them all. The case that he was charged with death penalty specifications that I became involved in was, think of this guy's already serving a life term for the murder of a grandmother, like an 80-year-old woman. And he's assigned to be the assistant to a local woman from Lucasville, the little community of Lucasville, who was a teacher at the school. And she liked him. She even requested a renewal of their teacher-aide relationship. Well, one day he took her into the staff restroom, locked the door, and slit her throat with the edge of like a notebook. He had taken it off a notebook and used it to slit her throat. And it was a very high publicity case. This was a local white woman killed by an imposing African American man. Everyone in that Lucasville community knew the victim of the crime. So eventually the defense succeeded in convincing the judge that it should be moved to Cincinnati rather than Portsmouth, which would have been the closest city, because they thought there's no way they can get a jury that would be fair. So they moved it, 100 miles away, to Cincinnati. But everyone assumed that Eddie Vaughn, who was the defendant in that case, would get the death penalty. The case had death penalty written all over it for the reasons I've described. But the jury came back with a life recommendation, and everyone was shocked. That they couldn't believe that the jury didn't sentence him to death. And I remember the day I got a call here at home from one of the defense attorneys telling me that was the jury's decision. He said, you better get ready, because your phone is going to start ringing off the hook. As soon as people in the statewide death penalty community learn that Eddie Vaughn got a life sentence and you were the defense mental health expert, you're going to be in very high demand. And that's what happened. That was the beginning of a career that ended up with my consultation on close to 300 death penalty cases in both state and federal court. My job was never to advocate for the person who was suspected of committing the crime. And I wasn't there to try and advance the defense cause. I was basically there as an educator to tell the jury what I had learned as a result of multiple interviews with the defendant, interviews with family members, review of thousands of pages of background records, educational records, health records, criminal justice records, juvenile court records. And so I always saw my role as an educator. And if I ever came across to a jury as an advocate for the defense side or an opponent of the death penalty, which I am personally, but I mean, if I ever came across as someone who was advocating for the defense cause, I would immediately lose my credibility. So I was there to be a teacher, basically. Well, he was very imposing physically, and they treated him, when I first went to see him, as if he was Hannibal Lecter. I was only allowed to communicate with him through a narrow opening in the door of his cell. But what surprised me about him, in light of his history as a very violent man, not only killing this teacher at Lucasville, but he had prior violent offenses as well. So I think I was expecting that he would be difficult for me when I went to interview with him and do testing with him and interact with him, and he wasn't at all. He was deferential, respectful. I got along with him well. He was polite. So that was a surprise to me, that his personality as he presented it to me was such a departure from the behavior that had landed him in the maximum security prison where he was when he killed this woman. Because of the situation he was in, I think he was on his best behavior. He perceived me as someone who had the potential to help him. If my testimony at the sentencing phase of his trial convinced the jury that he was a human being, a badly damaged one, and not the monster of their worst nightmares, there was a better chance that they would come back with a life sentence rather than the death penalty. So that was part of it. But I also think, and I don't mean to pat myself on the back, but I think I was a pretty good interviewer. And my approach, this is not the approach that all forensic psychologists take, but I really wanted to establish like a horizontal communication plane where I never introduced myself to the criminals I was being asked to evaluate as Dr. Smalldon. I always introduced myself as Jeff. Gave them my business card. They could see I had my PhD and I was a board certified forensic psychologist. I didn't need to tell them that. I wanted them to feel comfortable with me. So I always tried to establish kind of an easy conversational flavor to our interactions rather than me as the expert interrogating them. They're used to being interrogated by police and I didn't want to come across that way. And so I think with Eddie Vaughn, he responded to me personally. I think I was able to develop rapport with him. And then the other reason that you suggested, I thought I might be able to help him.